The sprawling penthouse of Ryan Westbrook gleamed under the harsh lights of the exclusive event. The room buzzed with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and business deals being sealed with a smile. It was Ryan's world, an empire built from algorithms, cutting-edge technology, and a drive that never let up. He was untouchable, the man who had everything: wealth, power, and adoration. Yet, as he stood at the center of the room, his arm wrapped around Elena Voss, the flawless supermodel by his side, something felt hollow. Ryan's empire was vast, spanning from Silicon Valley's brightest startups to luxury estates across the globe. At 38, he was the king of his own high-tech kingdom. The world saw him as a perfect machine, a cold, calculating billionaire who'd mastered the art of control. But in reality, his perfect world was just a mask. The weight of his success no longer thrilled him. Women, like Elena, came and went, their beauty and allure offering him nothing. His body, once a temple of desire, betrayed him. He should have felt the usual sparks as her lips brushed his ear, but all he felt was a growing emptiness. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This helps us grow. Now back to the story. What's wrong with you? Elena's voice sliced through the air like a sharp knife, her eyes narrowing as she pulled away, sensing the detachment in him. Panic began to claw at Ryan's chest as the familiar feeling of powerlessness set in. He forced a laugh, muttering some excuse about the wine. But the reality was undeniable. His manhood no longer rose for anyone, not even for a woman like Elena. He fled the gala in a hurry, his chauffeur speeding through the city streets, the lights flashing like memories he couldn't escape. By the time Ryan stumbled into his mansion at 3 a.m., the weight of his failure crashed down upon him. He sank into his leather sofa, head in hands, whispering to the empty room, "Am I broken? God, am I finally broken?" It was then that he heard it, a soft creak from the kitchen, the sound of someone moving quietly in the shadows, someone who had no reason to be part of his world. There, in the dim glow of the under-cabinet lights, stood Lila Cruz, the new maid. She was just wiping flour from her hands, her dark curls tied back, and a warm flush from her late-night baking ritual. Lila was not like the others. She didn't know the rules of the wealthy world Ryan inhabited, nor did she care. Her warm brown eyes met his for the first time, and in that brief, unspoken connection, something inside him stirred. For the first time in years, Ryan Westbrook felt alive again. But what did that mean? And what would he do about it? As he stood in the dimly lit hallway of his mansion, staring at the kitchen door where Lila Cruz had just stood, his thoughts raced. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in a room full of smoke, something so simple, yet it awakened something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was more than just the physical attraction that had startled him. It was her rawness, her warmth, the way she existed in his world without the pretensions he had grown used to. She wasn't dazzled by his wealth, nor was she trying to climb some invisible social ladder. Lila was real, and Ryan didn't know if that was a gift or a curse. He turned away from the kitchen door and ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. The emotions bubbling inside him were a storm he didn't know how to weather. The rational part of his mind told him to keep his distance, to focus on work and the empire he had built. After all, that's what had made him who he was. But there was something about her, something that refused to let him go. And now, every part of him wanted to know more. Lila Cruz had never planned on becoming the maid at Ryan Westbrook's sprawling estate. She had dreamed of much more than scrubbing floors and washing dishes. In another life, a life before everything had gone wrong, she had imagined herself dancing on stage, her feet gliding across polished floors in Broadway theaters. But life had a way of derailing dreams. She had come from Chicago, a city teeming with ambition and hard-won dreams, but also one that had broken her. Her ex-husband, Derek, had promised her the world, but all he delivered was disappointment. A failed musician, he had left her to pick up the pieces of their shattered life when he vanished one night, taking their savings and all her hopes with him. Lila's life had always been full of contradictions. Raised by her grandmother, who had shown her the power of love and resilience, Lila had always been taught to reach for the stars. But the harsh reality of the world had made her more practical, more grounded. Dreams could only carry you so far when you were struggling to put food on the table and a roof over your son's head. When Malik was born, the dreams of becoming a professional dancer faded into the background, replaced by the urgent need to survive. At 32, Lila was already a single mother with more responsibility than most could bear. She moved to California after a close friend mentioned an opening at the Westbrook estate, hoping for a fresh start and a chance to make enough money to keep the bills paid. Ryan Westbrook's world seemed as distant from hers as the moon, but the job paid well, and it was a chance to rebuild. When she first entered the mansion, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The polished floors, the gleaming chandeliers, the hushed tones of the staff, everything about the place screamed wealth. Lila felt like a ghost walking through a world she didn't belong to. Her simple clothes a stark contrast to the designer outfits she saw draped over the guests. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had a job. She had a roof over her son's head, and that was enough. In the silence of her small quarters at the estate, she often found herself thinking about the dreams she had long since put away. Every now and then, when Malik was asleep and the house was still, she would slip into the old dance routines she had once perfected in her living room. Her body moved as if it remembered the music, the rhythm, the freedom of being on stage. But there were no stages now, just the kitchen, the laundry room, the cleaning supplies. And as much as she longed to dance, she knew her real performance was the one she put on every day to keep moving forward, even when her spirit felt weighed down by the past. Ryan tried to ignore the stirrings in his chest whenever he saw Lila. He told himself it was just her simplicity, her lack of pretense, her genuine warmth that drew him in. It had been so long since anyone had made him feel anything other than indifference. He was used to women fawning over him, trying to get close to his fortune, his name, his power. But Lila didn't seem interested in any of that. She barely looked at him when she spoke, as if he were just another person in the room. And yet, her presence had an undeniable effect on him. He found himself paying attention to the small things, the way she hummed softly as she dusted his bookshelves, the way she would leave a steaming cup of coffee on his desk with a note, "Fuel for the fire, boss." It was little things like that, these unspoken gestures of kindness, that kept him coming back for more. Ryan didn't understand it. He had never been the type of man to let something as trivial as a maid's smile affect him. He had a carefully curated life, one where emotions were secondary to success. But there was something about Lila that made him feel, something deep inside him that had lain dormant for too long. He couldn't help himself. He started to ask her about Malik, about her life outside the estate. He made it seem casual, like small talk, but deep down, he was genuinely curious. What had brought her here? What was her story? But every time he asked, she seemed to close off, offering only the briefest answers. And yet, she didn't dismiss him outright. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of trust, that made Ryan think she was waiting for him to prove he was worth it. Ryan's internal battle was growing more complicated by the day. He couldn't figure out why he was so drawn to Lila. She was his maid, for God's sake. He had never considered crossing those boundaries before. He had been with women from the best social circles, women who understood the rules of his world. But Lila didn't play by the same rules. She didn't seem impressed by his wealth or his status. She saw him, really saw him, in a way that no one else did. And that scared him. He kept telling himself that he needed to focus on his work, that getting involved with someone like Lila would complicate everything. He couldn't afford to let emotions creep in. But every time he saw her, Every time their paths crossed, something inside him stirred, a flicker of longing, of desire, of something real. The walls he had spent years building around himself were starting to crumble, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold them up. One night, after a particularly tense board meeting, Ryan found himself wandering the halls of his mansion. His mind was racing with numbers, deals, and projections, but it all felt so hollow. He needed to escape. And that's when he found himself in his private study, seeking refuge from the pressure. And there, standing in the doorway, was Lila. She had been cleaning in the next room, but she had paused, sensing the tension in the air. Her warm gaze met his, and for the first time, Ryan saw her, really saw her. She wasn't just his maid. She wasn't just a piece of furniture in his estate. She was someone who had her own story, her own strength, and she had been carrying that weight silently, every day. "Mr. Westbrook," she said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Is everything all right?" The question was simple, but it hit Ryan like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just concern. It was the first time someone had cared about him in a way that didn't come with a price tag attached. For a moment, he forgot about the empire, the business, and the public persona he had built. In that moment, he felt like a man again. Not a billionaire, not a tech mogul, just a man. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he let himself be vulnerable. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Just a lot on my mind." She didn't say anything, but her gaze lingered on him. And in that silent moment, Ryan realized that something had shifted. He had been numb for so long, but now, he felt something. Something that scared him. It was the spark of something real. As the story unfolds, Ryan's emotional journey will continue, and his connection with Lila will evolve into something deeper than either of them expects. The conflict between their worlds, their differences in status, and their pasts will create obstacles, but it's their raw, unfiltered connection that will drive them forward. Ryan's attraction to Lila was undeniable. He couldn't ignore the pull, the way his body seemed to react whenever she was near. It started with the smallest things, a smile, the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear, the sound of her laugh as she cleaned. He had spent years perfecting his ability to shut down emotions, keeping everything in tight control. But with Lila, the walls he had spent a lifetime building were crumbling piece by piece, until all he could feel was the heat of her presence, the tension in his chest, the inexplicable hunger for something more. At first, he tried to tell himself it was just physical attraction, a fleeting impulse that would pass once he got over the novelty of someone like Lila, someone so different from the women he was used to. But the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger the feelings became. His indifference, the calm detachment he'd worn like armor, was shattering under the weight of his desire for her. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, although she was in her own unassuming way. It was her strength, her quiet resilience, the way she carried herself with a dignity that made her stand out among the polished, hollow people he spent his days with. Lila wasn't like the other women in his life who had been dazzled by his wealth and status. She wasn't trying to climb some social ladder, wasn't impressed by his name or fortune. No, she seemed indifferent to it all, and that made her all the more intriguing. Every time they crossed paths in the estate, his pulse would quicken, and his mind would cloud over. He would catch himself lingering in hallways a little longer, just to see her pass by, and he couldn't help but feel a strange thrill when she would look up at him with those warm, brown eyes that never judged him, never expected anything from him except what he was willing to offer. But it wasn't just physical. It was the way she listened to him, the way she made him feel like he mattered in a world that was full of empty transactions and faceless relationships. Lila, too, was conflicted. She could see the change in Ryan, the way he watched her with a gaze that was different from the cold, distant look he had once worn. She felt it in the way he began to ask her more questions, the way his tone softened when he spoke to her. But Lila had been burned before. She had trusted once, and it had cost her everything. When she had first arrived at the estate, she had kept her distance. The last thing she wanted was to get tangled up in the mess that was Ryan Westbrook. She knew his type, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, and she knew better than to believe in the fairy tale he might offer. Her past had taught her that much. She had been married to a man who had promised her the world only to leave her with nothing but heartbreak and an empty bank account. Her ex-husband, Derek, had made her feel like she was the most important thing in his world until he'd taken everything from her, disappearing without a trace and leaving her to pick up the pieces. Lila had learned the hard way that nothing was ever as it seemed. She'd put her dreams on hold when Malik was born, had sacrificed everything to raise him right, to give him a better life than the one she had been given. And now, standing in front of Ryan Westbrook, this man who was everything she had once dreamed of but never thought she'd be able to reach, she couldn't afford to let her guard down. But as much as she wanted to resist, there was something about Ryan that made it hard. It wasn't just his wealth, his success, or his outward charm. It was the way he seemed different from the others. Beneath the surface, she could see the cracks, the loneliness that he wore so carefully hidden. She knew that look. She had seen it in herself. The deep ache of longing for something real, something beyond the facades they both wore. As the days passed, Ryan couldn't help but find himself drawn to Lila. She became more than just the maid. She became someone he looked forward to seeing, someone who, without even trying, made him feel like he was more than the sum of his accomplishments. In the quiet moments when she wasn't looking, Ryan would catch glimpses of her, the way she moved so gracefully despite the hard work her hands had seen, the way she laughed at the smallest things, like a joke about Malik's endless energy, or the way she spoke of her past, her struggles, with a quiet dignity that made Ryan respect her in a way he hadn't respected anyone in a long time. In turn, Lila found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone in years. Ryan wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking for something from her. He wasn't looking for validation or approval. When he spoke to her, he seemed to listen, really listen, as if he was interested in her words, not just in what she could do for him. The more they spoke, the more Ryan began to share glimpses of his own life, his childhood in a sterile boarding school, his father's untimely death in a plane crash, the ruthless drive that had led him to where he was now. For the first time, he found himself admitting things to her he had never said aloud before. He told her about the loneliness that had driven him to build his empire, about the emotional walls he had constructed around himself to protect his heart from the world. And she listened, without judgment, without expectation. Lila, in turn, began to share pieces of her own story, how her dreams had been crushed under the weight of responsibility, how she had learned to survive in a world that didn't seem to care about people like her. She spoke of Malik's father, the man who had abandoned them both, and how, despite everything, she had never given up on hope, on the idea that life could still be something beautiful. Her words, laced with pain and hope, cut through Ryan's carefully constructed walls like a knife. He had never felt such an unspoken connection with anyone, not like this. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Ryan retreated to his private study to escape the mounting pressure. The numbers, the deals, the unrelenting demands of his world had left him feeling suffocated. He was alone in the dark, his thoughts swirling, when the soft sound of the door opening interrupted his solitude. It was Lila. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the doorframe, her eyes soft with concern. She had been assigned to help with some paperwork in the office, but the warmth of her gaze made Ryan realize just how much he had come to rely on her presence. "Is everything all right, Mr. Westbrook?" she asked quietly. Ryan, unguarded in his weariness, didn't pretend to have it all together. For the first time in a long while, he didn't want to hide behind his empire. He didn't want to play the role of the powerful billionaire who had everything figured out. "No," he replied, his voice rough. "Everything's not all right." "I'm not all right." Lila stepped into the room, closing the door behind her, and for the next few minutes, they just talked. No pretense, no walls, just two people, one broken and the other quietly strong, finding solace in each other's company. Ryan confided in her, sharing his disillusionment with the world he had built, the emptiness that success had brought him. Lila's response was simple but profound. "You're not the only one who's been broken, Mr. Westbrook, but that doesn't mean we can't rebuild." Her words hit him harder than anything he had heard in years. In that moment, he realized just how deep their connection ran. It was no longer just physical attraction, it was something much more. And yet, even as their connection deepened, the weight of their different worlds loomed over them. Ryan knew he couldn't keep pretending that nothing was changing. But what did that mean for him? For her? And for the world they both inhabited? As Ryan's personal life began to merge with his professional world, the pressure from outside forces grew. Whispers began to circulate among his social circle. Caroline, his ex-fiancée, returned to town with a vengeance. She had always been a polished socialite, and her bitterness toward Ryan had festered since their breakup. Seeing him so focused on Lila made her angry, made her feel like she had lost him to someone who didn't belong in his world. Caroline's tactics were subtle but effective. She made it clear to Ryan's colleagues that his attention on Lila was inappropriate, that it was undermining his reputation, and it wasn't long before the tabloids picked up on the story. Articles began to appear, hinting at the unspoken relationship between Ryan and his maid, painting it in the worst possible light. Ryan felt the pressure, but there was something inside him, something that had been awakened by Lila, that made him resist the urge to retreat into his old, safe shell. He couldn't pretend anymore. The conflict between his growing feelings for Lila and the expectations of his world was coming to a head. But the question remained, could he have both? Or would he have to choose? Ryan's attraction to Lila had ignited something deep inside him, something he couldn't control. But as their connection deepened, so did the stakes. The world they both lived in didn't allow for love between a billionaire and his maid. Ryan would have to decide whether he was willing to risk everything for something real or retreat back into his cold, unfeeling empire. The long day had worn Ryan thin. His mind was a whirlpool of boardroom numbers, strategies, and decisions. Each passing minute felt like a tick on a clock that didn't stop, a constant reminder of the empire he had built, but also of the life that seemed so hollow. Yet, through all of the noise and chaos, his thoughts kept drifting back to one thing, one person, Lila. She was everywhere, in the corners of his mind, the unspoken rhythm that guided his day. It was getting harder and harder to ignore. His attraction to her was no longer something he could dismiss with a forced shrug or a shallow excuse. He tried to tell himself it was just the exhaustion, the loneliness, but deep down, he knew better. It had been one of those nights, his endless schedule packed with meetings and high-stakes calls. He had retreated to his study, barely able to focus, his mind caught between the pressure of his work and the undeniable pull of the woman who had quietly become the most important person in his life. That was, until he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps echoing from the kitchen. Ryan wasn't sure what pulled him toward the kitchen. Maybe it was the stillness, the idea of a moment of solitude. Maybe it was the need to see her. Whatever it was, he found himself standing in the doorway, watching as Lila moved about the kitchen, preparing something. He wasn't sure what. It was just the two of them in the vast house, the evening quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a utensil against a dish. There was no need for words, no pretense, just the two of them, existing in this space that felt infinitely more intimate than any conversation they had shared. Lila looked up, her eyes soft and unguarded, like she had no idea how much she was affecting him. She smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but it was enough to send a ripple of warmth through Ryan's chest.
"You look tired,"
she said, her voice soothing like a gentle lullaby.
"It's been a long day, hasn't it?"
Ryan nodded, leaning against the doorframe, still watching her as she moved around the kitchen with ease.
"It's been
overwhelming," he admitted. Lila turned, wiping her hands on the apron she wore, and their eyes met in the dim light of the kitchen. In that moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just him and her, two people, connected in a way neither had been before. The tension between them, so thick it was almost tangible, had been building for weeks, and now it seemed to explode in the quiet of the kitchen. Without thinking, Ryan stepped closer to her. The distance between them closed in a heartbeat. Lila's breath caught in her throat as he reached out, one hand brushing against her cheek. She didn't pull away. Ryan started, his voice strained, unsure of how to voice the storm inside him. He couldn't find the words, couldn't explain why every part of him was suddenly drawn to her in a way he couldn't control. So instead of words, he leaned in. The kiss was sudden, impulsive. At first it was tender, unsure, a moment of hesitation that didn't last. Lila's lips were warm against his, soft, and the sensation was like a jolt of electricity shooting through his veins. His body responded before his mind could process what was happening. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her skin as the kiss deepened. It felt like coming alive again, something he hadn't felt in years. The world outside of this kitchen, of this house, of his empire, it all seemed to disappear in that single moment. There was no wealth, no status, no expectation. There was only Lila and him. Nothing else mattered. But then, just as quickly, Lila pulled back, her hands resting on his chest, pushing him gently away. The heat in her eyes faded, replaced by uncertainty. She looked at him, her breath shallow, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened.
"Ryan,"
she whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and regret. I can't do this." Her words hit him harder than he expected. The walls he had built around himself, the control he had mastered for so many years, were now crumbling. He could feel her pulling away, and part of him wanted to chase after her, to force her to understand that this feeling, was real, something he hadn't experienced in so long. But a part of him understood why she was pulling away. He could see it in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear. She wasn't just afraid of what this meant for her. She was afraid of him, of what he represented, and what that might mean for her future. "I don't want to complicate your life, Lila," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this." Lila's gaze softened, but there was still a sadness in her eyes, a resignation that broke something deep inside Ryan.
"I know," she said quietly, "but I'm not like you, Ryan. I can't let myself be a part of this world."
She gestured to the luxurious kitchen around them, the marble countertops, the golden fixtures, everything that was so foreign to her.
"You're used to people like me, but I'm not. And this, what just happened, can't happen again."
Ryan felt a pang in his chest, a sharp pain that made it hard to breathe. She was right. He was used to people who only saw him for what he could give them. But with Lila, it was different. She didn't want anything from him. She saw him, truly saw him, in a way that no one else had in years, and that made him feel vulnerable. It made him feel alive in a way he had long forgotten. The kiss haunted both of them. Ryan found himself restless, unable to focus on anything other than Lila. Every glance, every moment when their paths crossed in the mansion sent a shock of desire through him. But every time he tried to get close, to speak to her, something held him back. He couldn't ignore the weight of her rejection, even though he knew it wasn't personal. It was the life they lived, the divide between them that was too wide to cross. Lila, too, couldn't shake the memory of the kiss. She had never been this close to someone like Ryan, someone who had everything but still felt so empty. The way he had kissed her, the way he had held her, it made her feel seen, like she wasn't just the maid, the woman who had to work for every little thing. It made her feel beautiful, important, like she mattered. But the reality of their worlds collided every time she thought about it. She couldn't let herself be caught up in a fantasy that was destined to hurt both of them. She knew that a relationship with Ryan would never work. She couldn't become someone who just existed on the fringes of his life. She couldn't be the woman he turned to in the quiet moments, only to discard when the world of power and privilege called him away. No matter how much she wanted him, no matter how much she had felt in that kiss, she couldn't be the one to bring that chaos into her life. Lila's life was already complicated enough, but things were about to get worse. One evening, just a few days after the kiss, she arrived home from her shift to find a notice pinned to the door of her small apartment. Eviction notice. She stared at it, her heart sinking into her stomach. She had known this was coming, the rent hikes, the constant juggling of bills, but seeing it in writing was another thing entirely. She hadn't wanted to tell Ryan. She didn't want to lean on him, to make him feel obligated to help. But as she stood there, staring at the notice, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. She had always made do. She had always found a way. But this time, she wasn't sure how she would survive. Ryan, on the other hand, felt the familiar tug of desire to help her. He couldn't just stand by and watch Lila suffer. The thought of her being out on the streets made his chest tighten, but he knew the boundaries he had to respect. She had made it clear that she didn't want his charity, and that more than anything, made him realize just how much he had come to care for her. He wanted to fix it, wanted to offer her everything she needed to make it right. But Lila's refusal made him stop. The walls between them, built by their different worlds, were growing higher by the day. The pressure of their worlds colliding was too much. Neither Ryan nor Lila could ignore the growing desire between them. But both knew that their connection came with consequences. Ryan wanted to fight for what he felt. But could he? And more importantly, could Lila allow herself to cross the line into a world where she had no place? Their growing intimacy had ignited something neither of them could ignore. But the walls they each carried, built by their pasts and their lives, would make it nearly impossible for them to truly be together. In the end, the question remained. Would they break through the barriers, or would they both fall back into the worlds they had built to protect themselves? Ryan Westbrook had built his life around control. Every decision, every action, every relationship had been meticulously calculated. He had constructed an empire of technology and wealth that reached across the globe, but for all his success, there was one thing he could never control: his feelings. And now, Lila Cruz was the reason he felt more helpless than ever. Her financial struggles, the eviction notice, the constant strain of trying to make ends meet, it weighed on him. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet desperation that she tried so hard to hide. He had seen the way she carried herself, always with dignity, even as her world seemed to crumble around her. And yet, every time he asked how she was doing, she would shrug it off, offering him a polite smile, pretending that everything was fine. But he could see through the act. And that made him feel powerless. Ryan's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He wanted to help her, wanted to sweep her up and take away her burdens. He wanted to give her everything she deserved, to buy her out of this situation, to make her life easier. But every time the thought crossed his mind, a wall went up inside him. It was the same wall that had protected him from vulnerability for years, the same wall that kept him emotionally distant from everyone who had ever entered his life. Lila was different. She made him feel things he hadn't felt in a long time, things that scared him. The more he thought about helping her, the more frustrated he became with himself. He didn't know how to offer help without undermining the very thing that made her who she was.
her independence. It wasn't just the financial gap between them. It was everything else, the divide in their worlds. She didn't belong to his universe. She wasn't part of the polished world of luxury and privilege that he had created for himself. And every time he thought about reaching out, about bridging that gap, a sense of inadequacy gnawed at him. The conflict raged inside Ryan like a tidal wave. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business, his wealth, and even his emotions. But with Lila, it was different. He couldn't control it. He couldn't control her. And that terrified him. He sat in his study, staring at the numbers on his laptop screen, but they blurred together in a haze. His thoughts were consumed by her, the way her smile had lit up the room, the way her eyes held secrets she wasn't ready to share. Every time he thought about her, his chest tightened, a mixture of longing and fear churning in his stomach. He had tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that he was the man who didn't let emotions get in the way of his success. But with her, it was impossible. She had become a constant presence in his life, whether he was near her or not. The mere thought of her had him restless, unable to focus on the tasks at hand. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about how she was struggling, about how she had pushed him away when he had tried to offer help. And every time he tried to push his feelings aside, they only grew stronger. There was a part of him that wanted to run, to retreat into the comfort of his wealth and power, where nothing could touch him. But there was another part of him, the part that was finally waking up, that wanted to reach out, to be there for her, even if it meant exposing himself in a way he never had before. Ryan knew he had to make a choice. He could continue to hide behind his empire, pretending that wealth and success were enough to fill the void inside him. Or he could choose something real, something that terrified him, a connection with Lila that might cost him everything. But as the days passed and Lila's struggles continued, the weight of his indecision became unbearable. The challenge wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about helping Lila pay her bills, or giving her the financial security she so desperately needed. It was about something deeper, about his own fear of vulnerability. Ryan had never let anyone see his weaknesses, had never allowed himself to be truly seen. He had built a life around strength, around control, around the idea that he was untouchable. But Lila had a way of making him feel small, of making him question everything he had ever believed about himself. She didn't want his money. She didn't need him to save her. And that was the problem. Ryan wasn't used to being needed for anything other than what he could give. He had spent years avoiding anything that could make him feel inadequate. And now here was Lila, someone who didn't need him in the way he was used to being needed. She saw through his walls. She saw the real him, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. He wanted to be with her, wanted to help her, but every time he tried to take a step forward, he was pulled back by his own insecurities. He didn't know how to navigate this new territory, how to be vulnerable in a way that didn't make him feel weak. He fought it. He fought the desire to reach out to her, to take away her pain. But the more he fought, the more it seemed to pull him in. His feelings for her were growing, and he couldn't control it. And that, more than anything, terrified him. It wasn't until he had a confrontation with Caroline that the full weight of his internal struggle hit him. Caroline, his ex-fiancée, had always been a polished socialite, the perfect woman in the perfect world. She had once been the woman he thought he wanted, until she tore his world apart. She had exposed him to the world in a tabloid tell-all, humiliating him in front of millions. Since their breakup, Caroline had made it her mission to remind Ryan of his shortcomings, of how he had failed her, and how he was now failing in every area of his life. She had come to his office that afternoon, an air of condescension surrounding her as always. She had asked about the recent rumors surrounding Ryan's attention to Lila, her voice dripping with disdain. "I didn't think you were the type, Ryan," she had said, her eyes flashing with amusement. "But it seems you found a new little plaything in the Maid. How quaint." Ryan had tried to brush it off, but the words stung. Caroline always knew how to get under his skin, always knew how to make him question his choices. "It's none of your business," he had replied, his voice tight with the anger he had learned to bury. But Caroline wasn't done. "You're losing your edge, Ryan. I thought you were better than this. You've got a reputation to maintain, and here you are, with a woman who's beneath you. Do you really think this will end well for you?" And that was the moment it all clicked. Caroline was right. He had been hiding behind his wealth and power for so long that he had convinced himself it was enough. But now, standing there in front of her, listening to her words, Ryan realized something he had been refusing to admit to himself. He had been living a lie. The truth was, he didn't want to be with someone like Caroline anymore. He didn't want the perfect, polished image of a life that wasn't real. He didn't want a life of superficiality, of masks and pretenses. What he wanted was something real, something honest, and that something was Lila. That night, as the weight of his conversation with Caroline lingered in his mind, Ryan received an unexpected call. His sister Sophie was frantic on the other end. Their father had been rushed to the hospital after a sudden stroke. The family was in crisis. Ryan didn't hesitate. He was in his car within minutes, speeding through the city, his mind racing with worry. The empire he had built, the business deals, the stock market fluctuations, none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was his family. What mattered was being there for them, despite the walls he had built around himself. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the hospital, Ryan made a decision. He could no longer hide from the truth. He couldn't keep pretending that his wealth and status were enough to fill the void in his life. It wasn't just about fixing his family's problems, about securing his empire. It was about fixing himself. It was about taking a leap of faith, stepping into the unknown and being vulnerable. And it was about Lila. As soon as the crisis settled, Ryan knew what he had to do. He had to stand by her, no matter the consequences. He would push aside his fears, his insecurities, and the walls he had spent so many years building. He would choose love over power. The decision marked the turning point for Ryan. For the first time in years, he chose to be human, and that meant stepping into the unknown with Lila by his side. Ryan Westbrook had never been the type to care about public opinion. He had spent years building his empire on the foundation of his decisions, his strategies, and his ruthless ambition. He had carefully crafted a world where everything was in its place, perfectly polished, controlled, and above reproach. Nothing and no one could shake the confidence he had in his own ability to keep it all together. Until Lila. Choosing her, choosing to be with her, had done what no market crash, no business deal gone wrong, no corporate enemy had ever done before. It had created a rift, not just in his professional world, but in his personal life as well. People in his circle, once loyal and respectful, were now questioning him. His family whispered behind his back, his colleagues made subtle comments, and the media, the ever-hungry beast it was, had seized on his relationship with Lila as the latest scandal to sell. It had started with an innocuous picture, a casual shot of him and Lila at an event, snapped by a paparazzi who had been in the right place at the right time. The story quickly spiraled out of control. What was once a private connection between two people became fodder for gossip columns. The headlines were ruthless. "Billionaires fall from grace, Westbrook and his maid," one read. Another, "Westbrook's tainted romance, how Lila Cruz came to take over his heart and his fortune." The tabloids had a field day. Caroline, his ex-fiancée, saw an opportunity in the chaos. Her voice, though silenced in his life, echoed loudly in the press. Her whispered accusations, laced with venom, spread like wildfire. She painted a picture of a man who had once been on top, now losing control. The public lapped it up. Those who had once admired Ryan for his power and precision now turned on him, questioning his judgment, his taste, and his future. And all the while, Caroline's voice remained in the background, poisoning the well, feeding the press with more tidbits of information to keep the scandal alive. Ryan hadn't anticipated how much this would affect his business. Investors, previously eager to invest in his companies, were suddenly hesitant. The stock prices began to dip. Board members, who had once praised his unwavering focus, now started to question his priorities. They began to suggest that perhaps he wasn't the leader they once thought he was. In their eyes, a man who could choose a maid over his empire was no longer the titan they had invested in. It was a professional and personal crisis, all tangled together. Ryan's name was dragged through the mud, his reputation tarnished by an affair with a woman who didn't belong in his world. And as the pressure mounted, as the whispers grew louder, Ryan realized something he hadn't fully understood before. This was more than just a scandal. This was a war. And he was fighting on two fronts, one with the media and one with himself. Lila, too, was feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Though she had always believed in her ability to endure, this was different. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about exposing herself to a world that would never accept her. She was a maid, a woman who had spent her life scraping by, doing everything she could to provide for her son. She had never asked for fame, never sought the limelight. And yet, here she was, thrust into it, standing next to Ryan Westbrook, her life suddenly the subject of public scrutiny. She had tried to stay out of the spotlight for as long as possible, content to remain in the background, to blend in. But now that she was with Ryan, it felt as though the world was watching her every move. Every picture taken, every headline written, seemed to strip her of the anonymity she had once cherished. Ryan was a billionaire. He belonged in a world of high society, of endless wealth, of luxury and power. And she? She was just a woman from the south side of Chicago, a single mother who had taken the job at his estate to keep a roof over her son's head. She didn't belong in his world. And that was the truth she kept telling herself. She had already seen how the world treated women like her. They were disposable, forgotten, their stories not worth telling. Lila was afraid that, despite all the chemistry, despite the connection they shared, Ryan would eventually see her for what she was, a distraction, an inconvenience. She feared that his world would swallow her up, that she would be just another footnote in his life, another woman who had been discarded when the excitement faded. Ryan's world was too big, too shiny, too full of expectations she could never meet. She wasn't just afraid of losing him, she was afraid of losing herself in the process. One afternoon, just as the media storm was reaching its peak, Lila came to Ryan with news that would change everything. Her apartment, her home, had been marked with an eviction notice. The rent had gone up once again, and with her already strained finances, there was no way she could make the payment. She had been holding on for months, barely scraping by. But now, there was no more pretending. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice quiet but firm as she stood in the doorway of his study. "I can't keep depending on you, Ryan. This life, it's not mine. I don't belong here, and I don't want to be the reason your world falls apart." Ryan froze, his heart heavy in his chest. He had wanted to help her, of course. He wanted to give her everything she needed, to take away her pain, to make sure she never had to worry about anything again. But she didn't want that. She didn't want his money, his charity. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, even if it meant facing the world on her own terms. "I can't lose you, Lila," he said, his voice desperate. "Let me help you. Let me fix this." But Lila shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness that he couldn't bear. "No, Ryan. I can't let you fix me. I have to fix this myself. I can't let you be my savior. I won't let you make me feel like I'm only worth something because of what you give me." She turned away, leaving him standing there, hollowed out by the weight of her rejection. For the first time in his life, Ryan felt helpless. He could solve every problem in the world, but when it came to Lila, he couldn't fix what mattered most, her independence. Ryan had spent the next few days trying to convince himself that everything would work out. He didn't want to give up on her. He couldn't. But as the media continued to circle, as Caroline's whispers became louder, Ryan began to see just how impossible it was to have both worlds. The man who had built an empire of wealth and control now found himself on the edge of losing it all, not just his business, but Lila as well. His feelings for her were too strong to ignore, but the world he had built, the life he had created, seemed to be pushing her away. Lila's resistance was palpable, and each time Ryan tried to reach out, she pulled back further. She was afraid of what being with him meant, afraid of the consequences. She feared that her presence in his life would be the catalyst for his undoing. She was right, in a way. His world was crumbling. His board members were losing faith in him. The media was relentless, making every aspect of his life feel like a scandal. Caroline was enjoying every moment of Ryan's discomfort, twisting the knife further with each new tabloid headline. But through it all, Ryan knew one thing for sure. He couldn't lose her. No matter what the world said, no matter how impossible it seemed, he had to fight for her. As Ryan's professional life continued to spiral, he found himself standing at a crossroads. His relationship with Lila was more than just a romantic affair. It was a battle for trust, for belief in something real amidst a world of empty promises. Could they fight through the noise of the world, or was their love doomed from the start? Only time would tell if they could break through the barriers that surrounded them, or if the weight of their worlds would be too much to bear. But for now, all Ryan knew was that he wasn't willing to give up. Not on Lila, not on himself, and certainly not on the love that had slowly but surely taken root in his heart. The battle for trust had just begun. Ryan Westbrook sat in the dimly lit corner of his office, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like an iron fist. The room, which once buzzed with energy, ideas, and the hum of corporate power, now felt suffocating. His eyes scanned the city skyline, the endless rows of lights beneath him reminding him of everything he had built. His empire, his success, his perfect, impenetrable world. But now, with Lila at the forefront of his thoughts, none of it seemed to matter. He had spent years, decades really, building this life, this fortress of power and influence. It had become his identity, the ruthless, no-nonsense businessman who controlled everything, who was untouchable. But for the first time in his life, Ryan felt something he couldn't control. And that something was Lila. He couldn't just keep living this double life, one of cold, calculated business decisions and another of stolen moments with her. He had made his choice, and it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the empire he had built or the prestige he had earned. It was about something deeper. It was about love. Ryan stood from his desk, a sudden resolve hardening inside him. He couldn't keep pretending that he could have it all. His business was slipping away. His personal life was in turmoil, and the more he tried to control it, the more it seemed to spiral out of his grasp. He had already risked so much by choosing Lila, by choosing something real. But if he truly wanted her, if he wanted this love to survive, he had to let go of the very thing that had defined him for so long. The decision was made. Ryan walked into his boardroom the following morning, his mind set. The once pristine office, filled with glass desks, polished surfaces, and sleek modernity, felt alien to him now. He stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the same faces that had watched him rise, that had once been in awe of his every move. But now, as he looked around, he felt like a stranger in his own world. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't name. "I've made a decision. We're downsizing. We're refocusing." The room fell silent, the faces of his directors a mixture of shock, confusion, and skepticism. It was the kind of move that most CEOs wouldn't dream of making. They had built their empire on expansion, on constantly growing and acquiring. But Ryan's decision was different. He was about to dismantle parts of the empire he had worked so hard to create, and it was a sacrifice he was willing to make. "We will be divesting from several ventures that no longer align with our core mission," Ryan continued, his voice more resolute now. "I'm not here to make more money, gentlemen. I'm here to reclaim something I lost along the way. We need to focus on what really matters, on people, on relationships, on living with purpose. And that starts with me." The board members exchanged glances, whispers filling the room. "You're talking about cutting profits," one of them said, his tone incredulous. "This will impact stock prices, Ryan. Are you sure about this?" Ryan turned to face him, meeting the gaze of his board, his resolve unwavering. "I'm sure. We're making this shift for the long term, for what really matters. We're investing in people, and that's something you'll just have to trust me on." There was a brief pause, and then the tension seemed to ease, slightly. The board members didn't look convinced, but they knew better than to challenge Ryan when he made a decision like this. The man had always been one step ahead of them, always calculating, always in control. But this was something different. Ryan walked out of the meeting with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience. The weight of his decision was already starting to settle, and he knew he had made the right choice. He was sacrificing a part of himself, the part that had always defined him in the world of business, but he was doing it for something far greater. Lila sat across from Ryan, the familiar tension between them no longer a wall, but a bridge that connected them in a way that neither could have anticipated. After weeks of avoiding the inevitable, she had finally allowed herself to embrace the love they shared. It had taken time, but she was starting to believe in the possibility of a future with him. Ryan had done something she hadn't expected. He had chosen her, not his wealth, not his empire. And though the decision came with its own set of complications, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the first time in a long while. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, afraid to trust, afraid to be vulnerable. But with Ryan, she felt something different, a kind of safety she had never known. Their relationship, though complicated by the vast differences between their worlds, had become a refuge for both of them. They spent more time together now, quiet dinners, long walks in the gardens of the estate, moments when the world felt small and nothing else mattered except the two of them. But still, doubts lingered in Lila's mind. She could feel the pressure mounting. The media, the judgment of others, it all weighed heavily on her. She was falling in love with a man who had everything but the one thing he had always been searching for, something real. And she wasn't sure she could offer him that. She had seen it before, men like Ryan, who could have anything and anyone they wanted. What happened when the newness wore off? What happened when the real world of her struggles, her bills, her past, came crashing into his world of luxury and privilege? Lila had started to let her guard down, but a part of her remained unsure. Was this love, or was it just another fleeting distraction in Ryan's life? She didn't want to be just another conquest, another woman who had come and gone. She needed more than that. Just when things seemed to be settling into some kind of routine, fate threw another wrench into their carefully constructed world. Lila received an eviction notice from her landlord. She had been struggling with rent for months, but now it was official. She had no way of paying it, and no one to turn to. Ryan had been offering help, but she couldn't accept it. She couldn't let him fix everything. That evening, she sat on the edge of her bed, the eviction notice clutched in her hand, feeling the weight of her life crushing down on her. It wasn't just the bills, the debts, the unending struggle. It was the fear that, no matter how much she wanted it, she couldn't allow herself to be the woman Ryan thought she was. When she went to him with the news, the heaviness in her heart threatened to suffocate her. She had to keep pushing him away, keep telling herself that this love, this life, wasn't for her. She couldn't live in a world that wasn't hers, no matter how much she longed for it. Ryan's response was a mixture of frustration and compassion. He wanted to fix everything for her, but Lila's pride wouldn't allow it. "You don't need to do this alone," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do," Lila replied, shaking her head. "I have to do this alone, Ryan. You've already given me more than I deserve. But I won't let you take care of me like I'm some charity case." The words stung, and for a moment Ryan's heart twisted in pain. He had spent his life making sure he didn't need anyone. But now, he wanted to be there for her in a way he had never been for anyone before. He wanted to share in her struggles, to bear the weight of her burdens together. But Lila couldn't see it that way. She was afraid. Afraid of losing herself in him, afraid of becoming someone she wasn't. And so, she pushed him away. Ryan had made his decision. He had downsized, given up parts of his empire, and it had come at a cost. Stock prices had dropped. Investors were nervous. The board was asking questions. Ryan's leadership was being questioned for the first time in his career. The balance he had spent so long maintaining was slipping through his fingers. But none of that mattered. None of it compared to the pain of Lila pulling away. She was the one thing he had ever wanted, and now he was losing her. And as the walls of his empire began to crack, Ryan realized that his world was no longer defined by stock prices or the approval of the board. It was defined by something far more important. And if he lost that, if he lost her, then nothing else mattered. Ryan had to make a choice. Would he let his empire crumble, or would he fight for the love that had the potential to heal him in ways nothing else could? Lila was worth the fight. He just hoped she realized that before it was too late. The battle for trust between them was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. Ryan had given up parts of his empire for her, but would she be willing to trust him enough to let him into her life completely? Only time would tell. The phone call came in the middle of the night. Ryan had just returned from a tense meeting with his board members, where the pressure of his recent decisions, downsizing his empire to focus on personal happiness, choosing Lila over the world he had built, had become a tangible weight on his shoulders. The investors were wary, the stock price had dipped again, and his personal life had become fodder for the media. He sat in the darkness of his penthouse, staring out over the city that glittered beneath him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, seemed so fragile now. But what weighed heaviest on him wasn't his empire or the turmoil with his board, it was Lila. She had pulled away again, and no matter how many times he tried to reach her, she seemed to be slipping further from his grasp. He had made his choice. He had chosen her. But the world wasn't letting him forget the cost of that decision. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp reminder of the world outside. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. It was his assistant, Trent, the slick weasel who'd been running damage control since the first whispers of his relationship with Lila had made it into the tabloids. "Mr. Westbrook," Trent's voice crackled through the phone. "You need to see this." The moment Ryan clicked on the link Trent had sent him, his stomach dropped. The headline blared in his face. "Billionaire's scandalous love affair with his maid, Westbrook's fall from grace." Images of Ryan and Lila, taken from hidden angles during an event weeks ago, were splashed across the page, their private moments twisted into something sordid. The article had already gone viral, and social media was abuzz with speculation. Ryan's chest tightened as he read the words, each sentence more biting than the last. Was he really this weak? Could he truly not resist the temptation of someone beneath him? The media storm had begun, and it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Lila, too. They weren't just calling it an affair. They were painting her as a gold digger, a woman who had infiltrated his life to tear it all apart. They had taken their love and turned it into a scandal, a narrative that was more fiction than reality, but one that would be hard to erase. Ryan closed the article with a trembling hand and pushed the phone aside. He had always been a man who controlled the narrative. He had built his empire on that very principle. But this? This was something new. This was something personal. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, media inquiries, and behind-the-scenes discussions with his PR team. His life had been turned into a circus, and the world watched, eager for every messy detail. It wasn't just the tabloids now. Major news outlets were picking up the story, spinning it into a tale of betrayal and scandal. His own words were twisted, manipulated into sound bites that painted him as a man who had lost control. Ryan Westbrook's obsession with his maid, one headline read. "Billionaire's desperate affair with his employee threatens empire," said another. But the most painful part was seeing Lila's face, once a picture of strength and beauty, plastered across the front pages. She was being dragged through the mud along with him, her reputation shattered by a narrative she had never asked for. Ryan knew the truth. He knew that Lila wasn't the gold digger they made her out to be. She wasn't after his money or his status. She had never asked for anything from him except his respect and his love. But that truth didn't matter to the media. To them, it was all about the story, about the sensationalism. He couldn't sit back and let this happen. Not to Lila. Not to him. On the third day of the media frenzy, Ryan knew what he had to do. The pressure was mounting. Caroline's whispers were turning into public accusations, and his board members were on the verge of staging a coup. They wanted him to make a statement, to publicly distance himself from Lila before the damage was irreversible. They wanted him to protect the brand, protect the empire. But Ryan couldn't do it. He couldn't stand by and watch as Lila was demonized for something that wasn't her fault. He couldn't pretend that his feelings for her didn't matter. They did. They mattered more than anything else in the world. He called for an emergency press conference. As the cameras flashed and the microphones were handed to him, Ryan stood at the podium with his shoulders squared and his mind made up. He had spent his life controlling every narrative, but this time, he was ready to tell the truth. "I know what you've all been saying," Ryan began, his voice calm but firm. "And I know how you've spun this story. But I want you to hear it from me. I'm not ashamed of my relationship with Lila Cruz. I'm not ashamed of loving her." There was a sharp intake of breath from the room. Ryan could feel the tension rising, the weight of every eye in the room on him. But he pressed on. "She is not the woman you've painted her to be," he said, his gaze unwavering. "She's not a gold digger or a manipulator. She is an incredible woman, a woman who has done more for me than anyone else ever could. She's the reason I've found a part of myself I thought I had lost, and I won't apologize for that." The reporters were silent, waiting for him to continue. But Ryan was done hiding. He had lived his entire life behind walls, walls made of wealth, status, and power. But none of that mattered now, not in the face of the love he felt for Lila. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "and I've let my empire dictate my life for far too long. But I'm not going to let it define who I am anymore. I'm done hiding behind my wealth. I'm done pretending that what matters most isn't the people I love, the connections I make. I'm here, in front of all of you, because Lila deserves that. She deserves to be seen, not as some scandal, but as the woman she is. My partner. My equal." There was a long pause as the weight of his words sank in. And then the floodgates opened. Questions flew at him from every direction, reporters clamoring to ask about his future, his businesses, his personal life. But Ryan didn't flinch. He had already made his decision. He would stand by Lila. And nothing else mattered. Lila had been watching from the wings, standing in the back of the room, unseen by the cameras but unable to look away. Ryan's words hit her like a wave, washing over her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always feared being exposed, always feared what the world would think of her if she allowed herself to be seen with Ryan. But here he was, standing in front of the world, telling them that he loved her, that she was worth loving. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, trying to protect herself from the pain of being hurt again. But Ryan had done something she never thought possible. He had broken through those walls. And now, as she watched him declare his love for her, she felt a shift inside herself. The doubts that had plagued her, the fears that had kept her at arm's length, began to melt away. When the press conference ended, Ryan turned to find her standing there, her eyes wide, her heart racing. He stepped toward her, his voice soft but filled with intensity. "Lila, are you okay?" She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this. I don't know if I can live in this world with you. It's so different from mine. It's overwhelming." Ryan took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers. "I know it's scary," he said, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "But I'm here, Lila, and I'll always be here. We don't have to do this alone." Lila took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She loved him. She had loved him for so long, but it was only now that she was ready to admit it. "I love you, Ryan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm scared. I'm scared of what this means for us. I'm scared of what I'm going to lose." Ryan cupped her face in his hands, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your life. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us, because I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out. Together." The intensity of the moment hung in the air between them, and in that instant, everything seemed to fall into place. Their worlds were different, yes, but together they could make something real out of it. As the media storm began to quiet and the world around them continued to shift, Ryan and Lila realized something important. Love wasn't easy. It wasn't something they could take for granted, but it was worth the fight. And as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, they knew that the greatest sacrifice they would ever make was not just for each other, but for the chance to truly live their lives, unafraid of what others might say. They had chosen each other, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. The last few months had been nothing short of a whirlwind for Ryan and Lila. The media storm, the pressure from his board, and the weight of their love under the public's scrutinizing gaze had nearly torn them apart. But through it all, they had found something stronger than the world that sought to pull them in different directions: each other. Ryan had made decisions that, in the past, would have seemed unthinkable. The empire he had spent so many years building, so much of his identity wrapped in the numbers, the mergers, the power, was no longer the foundation of his life. Instead, he had sacrificed pieces of it. He had chosen a different path, one where love and authenticity came first, where the pursuit of happiness wasn't measured in stock prices and acquisitions, but in genuine connection and meaningful moments. For the first time, he realized that everything he had fought for, everything he thought he wanted, wasn't enough without someone to share it with. And that someone was Lila. Ryan stood in the middle of his new, scaled-back office, the skyline of the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was quieter now, less ostentatious, more reflective of the man he had become. His office wasn't a towering testament to wealth anymore. It was a place for planning, for vision, for something real. The polished marble floors and the sleek glass furniture had been replaced with something more comfortable, more grounded. The change wasn't just aesthetic, it was profound. The decision to downsize his empire had been the hardest one he had ever made. He had given up acquisitions, sold off underperforming ventures, and handed over the reins of certain parts of his business to trusted partners. His empire was smaller now, yes, but it was his, and it was built on the values he had come to embrace in the months since choosing Lila. She stood beside him now, no longer just his maid, no longer just a woman he was in love with. Lila was his equal, his partner in every sense of the word. She had never asked for a throne beside him, but he had given it to her. And in doing so, Ryan had finally felt the sense of fulfillment that had eluded him for so long. Lila's journey had been one of growth, too. She had learned to trust, to believe in the love Ryan offered her, and to see herself not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged beside him. Her initial doubts, the fear that she didn't belong in his world, the fear that his wealth and status would ultimately drive them apart, had been replaced with something far more powerful. She had seen Ryan for who he truly was, a man who had broken free from the chains of his own success and learned to live with purpose, to embrace love without conditions. Now, as they stood in this new chapter of their lives, the weight of the past seemed to lift. Ryan wasn't the man he had once been, the man who thought his worth was defined by his empire. He was something else now, a man who knew what truly mattered. Lila, standing beside him, had become the heart of their new life. She was not a woman who needed to be saved, but one who had saved him in ways he couldn't explain. Her strength, her resilience, her capacity for love had shown him what it meant to be truly alive. Together, they had built something new, something real, and in doing so, they had found a future not defined by the shadows of their pasts, but by the strength of their love for one another. Ryan sat back in his chair, gazing out at the city below. The skyline was still impressive, the lights twinkling like jewels in the darkness, but it no longer held the same allure. He had spent so many years chasing after the next big deal, the next acquisition, the next step up the ladder. For a while, it had seemed like the only thing that mattered. But now, he saw it all for what it was, a series of distractions that kept him from what he truly needed. He had spent so much time focused on building a perfect world, one where power, money, and control were the currencies that dictated success. But those things that had once felt so important, now felt insignificant in comparison to what he had with Lila. Lila had awakened him to something he had lost sight of long ago, the possibility of real connection. She had shown him what it meant to live with vulnerability, to let go of the armor he had worn for so many years. And in return, Ryan had given her a world where love, not status, mattered most. The sacrifices he had made, though difficult, had been worth it. He didn't need the biggest empire in the world anymore. What he needed, what he wanted, was to build a life with Lila. The man he was now was someone who valued authenticity over pretense, love over power, and connection over isolation. He had learned that success wasn't measured in stock prices or accolades, but in the people who loved you and the life you were able to create together. And Lila had been the one to show him that. He glanced over at her now, as she walked through the doorway with a cup of coffee in her hand. She had a quiet confidence about her, something that had always been there but had grown stronger as they had navigated this journey together. She had never asked for anything from him except his heart, and that was something he had freely given. Her eyes met his as she approached, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. There were no cameras, no board members, no expectations, just the two of them, here, in the quiet of their new life. "How's the new office?" Lila asked, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Ryan chuckled softly, standing up to meet her. "It's different, but I think it's the right kind of different." She handed him the coffee, and he took it with a smile. "You're right," he said, his voice warm. "It's exactly what I needed." Lila's gaze softened as she stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We're both getting exactly what we needed," she said quietly, her voice full of meaning. Ryan reached for her hand, pulling her into him. In that moment, everything felt right. The weight of the world, the pressure of the past, the doubts and fears, they all seemed to fade into the background. What mattered now was the future they were building together. A future where love wasn't something to be fought for or sacrificed, it was something to be cherished. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan and Lila sat together on the terrace of their home, a quiet moment of peace settling between them. The city stretched out before them, But it no longer felt like a symbol of their struggles or their ambitions. It felt like a canvas, a new beginning waiting to be painted. The stars slowly began to appear in the sky above, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt at home. Home wasn't a place, wasn't a mansion or a business. Home was here, with Lila, where the world was small and love was all that mattered. As they sat together, their hands intertwined, they knew that no matter what the future held, they had each other. The journey they had taken had been difficult, but it had brought them to this moment. And in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his heart full, and looked at Lila. "I'm glad I chose you," he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. Lila smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "And I'm glad you chose us." Together they looked out at the night sky, the beginning of a new chapter unfolding before them. They had faced the challenges, fought through the doubts, and come out the other side stronger. And as the stars twinkled above, Ryan knew that this was only the beginning of the life they would build together, a life of love, authenticity, and the freedom to be who they truly were. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or the empire that defined them. It was the love they had found in each other. And for Ryan, that was everything. And if you're craving more emotional rides like this, subscribe now. We've got twists, tears, and triumphs waiting just for you. What's your take? Can love really rewrite the rules? Drop it in the comments below. Until next time, dream bold, love fierce.